You are so
then we don't even.
against the L1 changes. You want to keep Ethereum immutable and just keep it how it is.
Oh, no. I love the idea of reducing the slot times.
Okay.
GM, welcome everyone to another episode of The Rollup. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Justin Drake. Justin is one of the leading Ethereum researchers working over at the Ethereum Foundation. Recently, Justin's been battling in the research trenches, discussing topics such as scaling the L1, synchronous composability, based sequencing, the thesis for shared sequencers, and the incentive compatibility of rollups and the L1. We discuss all of this and more with Justin today on the Rollup. Before we get into it, first, a word from our sponsors. Enjoy.
Covalent is solving the long-term data availability problem where a lot of the data availability providers today in the modular space, when you post data to them, they actually only hold that data for about 12 to 16 days. And then it's basically, it could go into an archive node, or oftentimes it's just kind of put away into the abyss. And what Covalent's trying to do is build this long-term data availability solution, which can plug into some of these modular data availability providers and provide this longer-term perpetual data solution. So what we try to think of this as is when you post transaction data onto Celestia or Veil or any of these modular DA solutions or even Ethereum, Covalent is able to provide a long-term data storage and data availability platform for that data after the time period. Blockchains are billboards, not databases, and we need these providers in the space to be able to kind of hold on to the long-term data that is provided from these providers and these blockchain state. This is where Covalent comes in. They just had a nice rebrand. Check them out on Twitter as well as the website. Thank you for being here. Hope you enjoy the rest of the show.
Welcome aboard on our journey into the singularity. This is the endgame roadmap for Frax and Fraxtal, the new L2 out of the Frax ecosystem that is totally based on fractal scaling. Fraxtal is a modular L2 blockchain built by Frax with modular and fractal scaling in mind. Fractal scaling is based on the Mandelbrot set of fractal images, and it explains how L2s become L3s and the entire app chain lifecycle goes through its evolution. The Frax ecosystem is made of some of the top builders in the space and has stemmed from its OG days of the Frax stablecoin. It is now in the LST space, the LRT space, and this Fraxtal L2 joins the existing suite of Frax products, including Frax Swap and Frax Lend. You can see Frax Ferry, the bridge to go from any chain, Arbitrum, Optimism, or mainnet into the Fraxtal mainnet, bridge your tokens, and bring your Frax assets into the Fraxtal ecosystem. Join today to get the best out of Fraxtal. You are still early. Join today. Take part in our expedition into the singularity.
What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Rollup. Today, I expect to be discussing and answering the questions of, should we scale the L1 more? Do we need to decentralize sequencers? What is the incentives for sequencing on rollups? We are the Rollup. We're here with Justin Drake. Justin, we met in Brussels this year, I think at a pretty cool Cartesi event with some really fun chat. I don't know if you saw the panel with when Ed Felton was going at it with Mark from Optimism about fraud proofs, but that was pretty spicy.
Yeah, that was great. EFCC was pretty crazy for me because I forget the exact numbers, but I was doing something like 6 talks and 8 panels, and that was towards the very end of EFCC, and it was a bit of a marathon for me.
Yeah, saw the panels and presentations that you had at the beginning of the conference at the Cake Sequencing Day. I think
yes,
those are particularly relevant to some of the conversations happening in the zeitgeist nowadays with composability, the L1. And then sequencing as well. So, I mean, why don't we kind of recap the discourse over the last 2 or 3 days? There's been a lot going on, both Reddit and then responses on Twitter, back and forth. Maybe we can just kind of open up the floor as far as like what are what are you thinking about nowadays in response to kind of the nature of the conversation around rollups, the L1, and sequencers as well?
Yeah. So, Ethereum for a very long time has been wanting to scale. That's been a pain point for several years. And like technically speaking, I think we have made a lot of progress towards scaling. We've certainly like dramatically reduced the base fees, and we also have all the infrastructure necessary to do like full dank sharding and grow the data availability portion like even further. And in parallel to that, we have amazing progress with snarks and fraud proof. So from a pure kind of throughput perspective, TPS perspective, we have scaled dramatically. The problem is that some other issue kind of came up that we didn't like 100% like appreciate or foresee, is that the quality of the block space is kind of lower than what we'd want. Basically, we have these L2s, these rollups that are to a very large extent siloed, and that creates fragmentation for Ethereum. And for some time now, maybe a year, maybe a bit more, I've been thinking about how can we fix Ethereum fragmentation? And I have this meme around the united chains of Ethereum. How can we maximize the network effects of Ethereum, of the internet of value, if you will? And there's all sorts of things that we can do, right, at the wallet level, in terms of account abstraction. There's projects like AgLayer that try and provide cross rollup safety, like cross rollup bundles basically. And like one other aspect that I've been focusing on a lot is this idea of shared sequencing. When we have shared sequencing, we have an opportunity to do some magic, which is called synchronous composability. So this idea that any contract, regardless of which rollup you're on, can call another rollup that kind of shares the sequencer, and it's a direct call, just like Aave would directly call Uniswap, for example. So if we buy into this thesis of money Legos that compose with each other, so you build these superstructures over time, then composability is very, very important. And the alternative to synchronous composability is what's called asynchronous composability, where you basically have things happen in different blocks. Like you have some sort of action that starts in one block with one sequencer, and then it's kind of picked up by another entity, another sequencer in another block. And it sounds like such a minute little detail, 2 transactions, 2 blocks instead of 1 transaction, but it turns out to have relatively deep consequences from a DevX perspective, because it means that the way you build applications is completely different to what we have on L1 today, and it also has some ramifications from a UX perspective. It changes the feel of the applications that you end up building.
Yeah, and I think there is the asynchronous argument is presenting a very low latency argument to asynchronous composability that makes it feel like it's synchronous, but it's still not synchronous. There's nuances and intricacies that still provide advantages to synchronous composability. I again saw the presentation that you gave at Sequencing Day around synchronous composability that laid out quite a few user experience benefits as well as developer experience benefits. And so to just sound off on a few of those here, for the UX, you have potential lower latency because everything is in the same slot. You have fee certainty. You actually know how much the fees are. You have better pre-confirmations, potentially shared liquidity. You have more efficient liquidations if you can make those synchronous contract calls. And then you have the ability to do flash loans. Again, there are some nuances there, but those are all user experience benefits and advantages of synchronous composability. And then there's DevX benefits like when transactions will revert. You have the strongest link liveness shelling point. You have data compression, real-time proving, real-time settlement, and orchestration that can all provide these developer experience benefits. And so I think the argument as you've laid it out is basically that synchronous composability is important. That's the premise. For us to achieve synchronous composability, we need a shared environment, a shared sequencer, basically. And then because we need a shared sequencer to achieve synchronous composability, well, what is the best shared sequencer? It's the Ethereum validator set. We have the pseudo-random validator election mechanism that is comprised of 1,000 or maybe 1,000,000 plus validators. And so it's very, very decentralized, more decentralized than any validator set out there. It has tons of economic security. And so this makes for the best sequencer. Oh, it's also, by the way, a shared sequencer, and it's credibly neutral and it's censorship resistant because it's Ethereum's sequencer validator set. So this is kind of the argument for Ethereum for based sequencing and therefore based rollups, and to use the Ethereum sequencer, and basically the argument to be based, right? But then we have the entire other side where rollups are making money hand over fist. And so there's an incentive misalignment for them to give up some of their revenue. I'd love to get into how what makes up that revenue, whether it's base fees, priority fees. You mentioned in some of the recent posts, these execution congestion fees. So I'd like to dig into that. But basically, there's this incentive question or dilemma about moving away from centralized sequencers and moving on to decentralized and maybe even based sequencing. So that's the groundwork. And could you sort of dig into like the base fees and the priority fee dynamic, and then sort of demystify these execution congestion fees, these MEV fees? Where does revenue from these like base, how are they making their revenue? Where do those fees come from?
Sure. I mean, if you don't mind, I want to kind of tie off a couple things that you said. The first one is like you listed all like this list of advantages from a UX and a DevX perspective, and you might think that any given like advantage, like shared liquidity or flash loans, might not be important enough to justify shared sequencing and synchronous composability. But there is a long list, and I think the strongest intuition that I have for why Synchrony is valuable is actually an empirical one, where you look at successful blockchains in production today. You have like these blockchain systems that are extremely asynchronous, like Cosmos, like Polkadot, like Near, Dfinity, like the Ton from Telegram. And what do all these things have in common? They're not very successful with developers or with users, right? They've tried to do something that is scalable or with sharding or whatever, but that has come with costs. And then you look on the other side of the spectrum, you have Ethereum and Solana, that in some sense have gone down this synchronous route, and they've been very successful. Bitcoin is also has a synchronous virtual machine, even though it doesn't really make use of it. And so just empirically, I think that's where a lot of the intuition and conviction comes from, that Synchrony is the way forward. Another thing you mentioned is the need for a shared sequencer, and the key word you said is credible neutrality. And the reason is that in theory we could use any sequencer as a shared sequencer, but I think the most important aspect of a shared sequencer is credible neutrality, because you want to have projects and their competitors feel comfortable opting into neutral territory. And so if Arbitrum, develops their own sequencer, is Optimism Superchain going to opt in? Probably not, and vice versa. And so I think, in the short term, we're going to have ecosystem-wide shared sequencers within the superchain, for example, within the Arbitrum ecosystem. But I'm kind of thinking one step ahead, if you will, and trying to come with a compelling Ethereum-wide story. Now, there's various different projects that are working on this Ethereum-wide story. There's, for example, Espresso is maybe the best example. They have this notion of a shared sequencer for Ethereum. I guess the downside of these alternative sequencers is that, as you said, they compromise credible neutrality in some way or another. And the three things that are I guess easy to point out is that they introduce a new brand, they introduce a new token, and they introduce a new security assumption. And so by reusing the L1 validator set, we're maximally credibly neutral. But as we probably discussed, there's all sorts of things that need to be worked out for base sequencing to actually be compelling. And one of the big ones, which is your actual question, is around incentive compatibility. And the question boils down to, if I am an island and I'm playing alone as a silo, do I earn more than if I were to connect to a shared sequencer? And in order to kind of answer this question, we need to look at what are the incentives. And there's basically two sets of income for rollups. One is congestion, and this is specifically virtual machine congestion. So any given virtual machine will have a gas limit. For example, Base has a gas limit of, I believe, 120 million gas, and that's for a 2-second slot. And they also have, a corresponding gas target. And if there's just more demand than the virtual machine can deliver, then you have these congestion fees that start kicking in. And the good news here is that if you opt into a shared sequencer that you don't control, then you still keep your congestion fees as the virtual machine. The virtual machine congestion fees, in some sense, are agnostic of the ordering. They just care about throughput, total throughput, and total demand on the virtual machine. And then there's this other aspect, which I call contention fees, but is more usually known as MEV, which, naively speaking, if you were to just change the sequencer, you are going to lose. And so the question, at least, naively speaking, if you don't do fancy stuff, which we can talk about later, the question is the loss of MEV kind of compensated by the composability gains? And basically, my argument is that if you are to increase composability, if you were to connect, if you will, to this Internet of Value in the most strong way possible, then you would increase the value of your applications, the value of your state, and you'd have basically more traffic coming in, and you'd have more congestion fees. And that would basically compensate for the loss of MEV. Now, what I've tried to do is use the L1 as a proxy for the ratio, I guess, between congestion fees and contention fees. And the basic observation is that it's roughly an 80-20 ratio. So 80% of the income, at least on layer 1, comes from this congestion, the 1559 base fees. It's about 3,200 ETH per day, since we've had EIP 1559. And then we have MEV, which is about 800 ETH per day since the merge. I've had this thesis that the ratio is actually going to become even more extreme. So it's going to go from 80-20 to something like 99-1%. And the reason is that there's two main sources of MEV. There's sandwiching, which is a form of front running and back running together, and that should completely disappear. And actually, we're seeing it disappear like as we speak, in some sense. There's this very recent trend where the big wallets, for example, MetaMask, are no longer publicly gossiping, their users' transactions, and so the users' transactions are no longer exposed to sandwiching, and instead they go through OFAs and whatnot. And with encrypted mempools and with things like Suave and the proliferation of these private mempools, I think we're going to see this component, the sandwiching, just go to zero. And then there's another component of MEV, which is sex-dex arbitrage, the arbitrage between centralized exchanges and decentralized exchanges. And here it's a little bit more of a subtle story, but basically there's some various projects out there that are trying to build better decentralized exchanges, specifically decentralized exchanges that, instead of leaking the MEV to the sequencer, they recapture the MEV, and then they rebate it back to the LPs, the liquidity providers, and that ultimately means better prices, better liquidity for the users, and that ultimately probably means that this is going to be the winning place where liquidity and price formation happens. So if this were to come to bear, and there's various projects like Sorella that are working on these better dexes. One of the issues here is that we need to be patient, because Sorella is kind of hinges upon Uniswap V4 hooks, and Uniswap V4 hooks depend on the next Ethereum hard fork. So there's a little bit of a leap of faith you have to do in order to kind of believe that MEV is going to zero, but at least that's my thesis. And so if the ratio is indeed like 99%, 1%, then you need to ask yourself, is the gain from composability by having more traffic, will that compensate for the 1%? And I think, yeah, obviously, yes. Like, you're going to have way more traffic by being synchronously composable with the Internet of Value. And I call this the MEV gambit, right? Like, you give away the 1% of MEV, you give away a pawn, and then you win the game. Now, it turns out that the picture on layer 1 is very different to the picture on the L2s. And during the AMA, I kind of made the statement, which turned out to be completely wrong, that basically Base has no MEV, that is just fully all congestion. It turns out that Base was in this situation before July 2023, but then in July 2023 they did an upgrade where basically they changed the way that the sequencer worked. Instead of being first come first serve, it was basically a priority gas auction. And in a priority gas auction, what happens is that the MEV from arbitrage goes to the sequencer. They're essentially sequencer fees. And if you look at the data, about 80% of the income for Base is sequencer fees. And so, like, as things are today, go ahead.
Real quick, when you say sequencer fees, you mean these contention fees, or and yes. Correct me if I'm wrong, but people would call those the priority fees?
Yeah, so people use the term sequencer fees like a bit liberally. And what a lot of people say is that sequencer fees would be, for example, the $200 million that Coinbase is making through Base, like the aggregate fees that they're making in terms of income. But actually, the sequencer fees is specifically the subset of those fees which pertain to sequencing, which is the MEV, as you say. The other part, which is the virtual machine congestion fees, that is an easy thing to capture.
Got it. Okay. And so these are the fees that people are paying to have some sort of priority in the top of the block, or maybe in the bottom of the block, and reorder based on front running, back running, sandwiching.
Yeah.
And so
I mean, the way that it works, because it's actually relatively interesting, is that Base has 2-second slot times. And then within these 2 seconds, they take all the transactions that they received, and then they order them by priority fee. And then that is the order in which they get sequenced. And so what happens is that you have searchers, arbitragers, that are going to compete to have the lowest transaction index, basically position within the block. Position 0 would be at the very top, position 1, etc. And so what you see, there's this very interesting graph that was shared, where like most of the priority fees come for like these, position like 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, something like that. And then it tapers out, and then the vast majority of users, they pay, almost everything in congestion fees, and then they pay very little in priority fees. So if you're doing a transfer or an ERC20 transaction or some sort of NFT transaction, then more likely than not, you'll pay a tiny priority fee. And what's happening is that the data suggests that on Base, the DeFi arbitrage is just so overwhelming relative to the congestion fees. And part of the reason for that is that actually Coinbase has like repeatedly just like systematically killed virtual machine congestion fees, because every time there's a bit too much congestion fees rise, and then they increase the gas limit, and then it goes back down. And they have this whole roadmap to just keep increasing the gas limit, and so they're just constantly killing the base fees. And so this is part of the reason why there's a completely different ratio. It's actually inverted between the L1 and the L2.
Yeah, and I think that's the dilemma of the root cause of the parasitic argument, as well as the argument with regards to not using Ethereum for DA for other kind of validiums and optimiums that people are kind of getting at. But when it comes directly to base, given that this dynamic is how it is with regards to the priority fees, does this, in your view, kind of change the incentive structure on base or in a given L2's circumstances to move forward with a decentralized sequencing kind of process? Or like, how does this change the incentive dynamic for base to move away from a centralized sequencing?
Right. So there's actually like two decision points that are kind of slightly different. One question is, should the base sequencer decentralized? And that's an interesting question that we can look at. But an even kind of stronger question is, should they opt in to a decentralized sequencer which is not theirs? Basically, should they opt into a shared sequencer which is credibly neutral? Now, the decentralization aspect, I think, is actually fairly easy from the perspective of base. And the reason is that the way that you typically decentralize is that you introduce a new token, and then you have like validators, and then the validators will receive the MEV, and indirectly, the value of your token would be tied to the flows from MEV. So if there's like $1 billion of MEV per day, let's say, then the base token would be worth a ton because you want to stake so that you can go capture the MEV. So I think the decentralization is actually fairly easy. Another reason why I think the decentralization will be a kind of a no-brainer when the tech is mature enough is that, number one, assuming that these better dexes do flourish, then as we discussed before, like the ratio between congestion and contention will be very much in favor of decentralization. And then there's an even more subtle argument, which is this fancy research and development space called execution tickets, where basically the chain can sell execution slots, and what will happen is that the price that these tickets would sell on the open market would reflect the revenue that you could get, which is the MEV, and basically they could capture the MEV as well. The thing that I'm slightly worried about execution tickets is that, well, first of all, they add a little bit of complexity. Secondly, it's possible that they have some negative externalities in terms of centralization. Like if you're the best block builder, then you can afford to buy out the vast majority of tickets, and then this kind of self-reinforcing. And then another kind of worry that I have about execution tickets is that they might compromise the composability a little bit, right? Because if Coinbase has their own execution tickets and then some other projects has some other type of execution tickets, then the stars won't always align, and so you're reducing the opportunity for synchronous composability. And this is something that Espresso, for example, is trying to address. But that comes with its own set of trade-offs because it introduces its own token. So
yeah,
ultimately,
I was just going back and forth with Ellie from Espresso and Cecilia on Twitter today from Tycho and their base rollup, and we were just kind of discussing the trade-offs and kind of what the better use cases are for base sequencing versus basically opting into these kind of decentralized or shared sequencing models. And I think that the common thought that a lot of the rollup operators are going to be faced with is basically if they can sell their sequencing rights for a sum of revenue, which is somewhat, and this is going to be a subjective value or a subjective question for each one, is somewhat reasonably close to what they could get with centralizing. and the composability benefits, as well as perhaps thinking about like the regulatory benefits in a future state, there's a seesaw here where if it makes sense, then we'll see that kind of go through. But perhaps until that experiment is tried by a big roll-up operator, perhaps until there's more legal scrutiny, which we all hope that doesn't happen, then the incentive to kind of do it is going to be, like you're saying, it's a patient process. It's a game. It's a thing that's going to take some time. But that is kind of the trade-off that Ellie was describing, and I think Cecilia from Gwyneth also agreed. Although I'll tell you what, Justin, it's tough to get the base roll-up peeps off of their high horse, because the base roll-up peeps are very set on it being the best, and kind of like not really accepting other arguments, because it just seems to make the most sense from all the properties of liveness, composability, and then being able to kind of also return revenue to the roll-up operator as well, which I'm sure we're going to touch on more.
Yeah, I mean, once you get base pilled, it's difficult to unsee it. And the interesting thing is that it's kind of non-obvious, right? Just like, for example, call data, it was not obvious that it could be used by rollups. It was normally, you use call data to submit, inputs to a transaction. But here you could just arbitrarily post data that's relevant to rollup, and it's the same thing with the sequencer. In some sense, we're abusing or leveraging the sequencer in a way that's like slightly unexpected, and is like uniquely powerful. And once you see it, it's kind of hard to unsee it. But I guess the discussion for today doesn't have to be like around base rollups specifically. We can talk about more generally like decentralized rollups and decentralized sequences and shared sequences. I have a very strong belief that the base will have a decentralized sequencer within X number of years. I think it's bound to happen. There are some like technical limitations which I detailed in the AMA. One of them is around security. Turns out, and this is something that people don't really appreciate, but the sequencer is used as a security training wheel, whereby if there is a bug in the fraud proof or the snark verifier, this bug will not get exploited, because the only entity that's producing the blocks will make sure that the blocks are kosher and don't exploit the bug. For a bug to be kind of exploited, like the block producing process needs to be permissionless for the attacker to go build a block that actually exploits the bug. Another training wheel that centralized sequencers are used for is MEV front-running protection. So right now, what happens is that users basically send the transaction directly to the sequencer, the centralized sequencer. There is no public mempool. So from day one, there was no sandwiching, and this is a great feature to have. And in a decentralized context, it's much more messy. Like, okay, who do I send my transaction to? It could be some anonymous person on the internet, and so there's various solutions here. You could have like these fancy encrypted mempools like Suave, or you could go down this direction of having the wallets have their own OFAs and like public and private deals with the builders and whatnot. But that has its own set of trade-offs, because now you have exclusive order flow, and you have a lot of opacity behind the scenes. And then the third reason, if I can remember, for why it's used as a training wheel, help me out.
Pre-comp.
Oh yeah, fast UX. So you have a centralized sequencer which is running on AWS with extremely high uptime. The IP address never changes. It's like optimized for everything, for latency and throughput, and it's an amazing quality of service. And replicating that in a decentralized context is extremely difficult. Especially if you talk about a project like Arbitrum, which I believe has block times of 250 milliseconds. That's even faster than Solana. And there's it's very, very difficult to do decentralized sequencing at that kind of pace. And so it will take time to get the decentralized sequences, but they will come. I think the more pertinent question, I guess, around incentive alignment is the shared sequencer, where you're opting into a shared sequencer where the token is not yours. And so there isn't this indirect flow of MEV to your token. But then this goes back to the arguments that I put forward. One, the ratio should move in favor of congestion fees because of these better dexes. Two, we're going to have experimentation with tickets, and so there's some non-zero chance that the execution tickets will work out and be successful.
Vertex Edge is now live on Say Network. Say users can now trade 50 plus spot and perp markets with the unified order book liquidity of Vertex Edge across Arbitrum, Blast, Mantle, and Say. The next 6 weeks, 850,000 Say tokens will be up for grabs as trading rewards every single week, exclusively on Say. Join Vertex on Say Network now on Vertex Edge. That's vertexprotocol.com.
Mantle is a layer 2 blockchain with one of the biggest on-chain treasuries in all of crypto, and they had a 100-day campaign called Metamorphosis live now. What this is it is a campaign for their liquid staked ETH token, METH, as well as their upcoming liquid restaking token, CMETH, where you can utilize this token on the Mantle network in a variety of different apps, some of your favorite restaking protocols and DeFi protocols, and earn yields in the form of powder, which will eventually be turning into a governance token. Mantle's been around for a while. We like them because they use their own form of EigenDA. They have a good ecosystem and they're growing. So check out this 100-day Metamorphosis campaign and hope you guys enjoy the rest of this video.
There's two aspects you mentioned about why the MEV is going to reduce and base fees and congestion fees are going to be the majority. You mentioned better dexes and internalizing the MEV and then rebating the LPs. But then you also mentioned private order flow and encrypted mempools, which would encrypt the mempool so that you don't even know that the MEV is there. That seems, I see that as like, there's some trade-offs there because there was someone mentioned to me at ECC, it was Matt from Block Native, who did block building for a long time. And he mentioned that there's a lot of private order flow and encrypted mempools, which protects people from MEV, but it makes it very difficult to price a block or price the execution ticket, perhaps. And so I'm curious, when you extend sort of this private order flow, like you mentioned, MetaMask is no longer sending their order flow to a public mempool. I think it's at the rate of 60 to 70%. If we see that number creep higher, are you worried about the pricing for block space or blob space, or are there other ways to get around that?
Yeah, I'm aware of Matt's concerns, and I'm personally not too worried. Part of the reason is that what he's talking about is this edge case when there's more demand within a slot than the gas limit can supply, which happens fairly infrequently in the context of EIP 1559. So on the L1, for example, we have a ratio of 2x between the gas target and the gas limit. And so for the vast majority of slots, something like 95%, you can fit all the transactions that came in within this block. Like the 2x buffer acts as a dampener to absorb the transactions. And then for the 5% of cases, you basically devolve to a first price auction, where if you want to get in, then now you need to start a bidding up with the priority fee, which is what we had prior to EIP 1559. And in order to do this bidding properly, you need to have visibility as to what is going on here. And the reality is that a lot of entities have that visibility, right? Like, for example, relays, they have visibility as to how many transactions are out there in the quote mempool. The big builders also have visibility. The wallets also have a great deal of visibility. And so it's a matter of just surfacing this information so that in this edge case, then we can do proper pricing.
Let's sort of take this a little bit further into its logical conclusion. You mentioned that a lot of this is is on the time scale of X number of years in order to achieve decentralized and maybe shared sequencers. We'll get there; those will come. But there's certain upgrades to Ethereum that are going to have to take place. For instance, a hard fork. Could you kind of talk through like what the next hard fork for Ethereum looks like? And you mentioned that Uniswap V4 hooks are a part of that. How does that work? Why is that included in the next hard fork? And then what are some of the knock-on effects of that?
Right. So broadly speaking, like 99% of or a great deal of the considerations around sequencing have nothing to do with hard forks. They're like, it's a purely permissionless space. Anyone can spin up sequencers. It's at the application layer, and to a very large extent, it's a social coordination game. Like, how do we agree on a shelling point for this canonical Ethereum-wide sequencer? Now, you did mention the next hard fork, which basically, I believe, will have this optimization, this gas optimization, that is very, very useful to Uniswap. And so Uniswap V4 actually depends on this gas optimization to be very gas efficient. And Sorella depends on Uniswap V4, and the sequencers not receiving all this MEV depends on things like Sorella. So there is a chain reaction. I don't know exactly when the next hard fork will happen. It might happen later this year or earlier next year, and then there will be some amount of time until liquidity potentially migrates away. And so it will take some amount of time before the incentives become more advantageous towards opting into a shared sequencer. But again, like, decentralizing doesn't really depend on this Uniswap stuff, because if you have your own token, which actually Base does not, right? And so Base is a bit of a unique thing. But in any case, fixing the security issue that I mentioned is actually difficult, because we don't know how to build fraud proofs and ZK VMs without bugs. These are very, very complicated pieces of infrastructure that almost certainly have like critical vulnerabilities. And so like the reliance on these training wheels is important today. And like one of the strategies that we have to fix the security bug, or to at least greatly mitigate it, is to have client diversity. So instead of one implementation of a ZK VM, you have 3 of them, and they all need to agree in order for things to go through. And it's very, very unlikely that the exact same bug is in the 3 different implementations. Another approach could be formal verification, which is this heavy-duty mathematical tool that actually proves mathematically that the circuit is correct, for example. And we can do that, and we will do that. And there's somewhat of a clear line, a clear plan to actually do that. And the Ethereum Foundation is allocating a lot of money. It's allocating $20 million towards actually completing this huge engineering effort. But it will happen. And all of these things happen on timescales that are maybe longer than just the next hard fork, which should happen in a matter of months.
Got it. And okay, so coming through then to this like conversation that has with Max on the pod on Bankless about improving the L1, and then kind of like this Reddit conversation, like when we're thinking about the key priorities from your perspective with regards to this kind of client diversity and this upcoming hard fork, and how you're thinking about the broader landscape of Ethereum, including base sequencing, like where are you seeing the top priorities for Rollups as you see them today in terms of their next step to get to the next stage of their development? And where are you seeing like kind of like butting heads with other people in the Ethereum ecosystem who have a different perspective? And like, putting that together, how do we align on the best next steps to make Rollups, to get Rollups to the next era of their development?
Yeah. I mean, I think that Rollups are actually doing pretty well. They're moving at a steady pace. I mean, one thing that we've been disappointed as a community is that for example, fraud proofs took way too long to come to production. But in general, I think we're making a lot of progress. And as I mentioned, there's going to be these incremental steps or intermediate steps, like having shared sequencers within specific ecosystems. And shared sequencing is actually not the only thing that needs to happen. There's other surrounding pieces of technology that need to be built out for this vision of synchronous composability to really be compelling. So let me give a few examples. One is that having shared deposits would be very, very nice, because when you want to do a transfer from one L2 to another L2, the canonical way to do it today is to go through the L1. So you do a withdrawal from L2 to L1, and then you do a deposit from L1 to L2. And even though you're just touching the L1 minimally just to do a withdrawal and deposit, you're still touching the L1, which is suboptimal. And so really what we want is this layer of shared deposits, basically some sort of rollup that does one thing only, which is to accept deposits on behalf of the other rollups. And then now you can do L2 to L2 transactions without going through the L1. And that's going to be extremely, extremely gas efficient. And again, I think what's going to happen is that within ecosystems like the superchain or Polygon or whatever it is, we're going to see these experiments happen. And they're going to be parallel experiments, and we're all going to be able to learn from each other. And then ultimately, at some point, the experimentation will have happened enough that we can pick the best ideas and kind of suggest and try and standardize some sort of Ethereum-wide solution where all the rollups and their competitor ecosystems can feel comfortable opting in. Another aspect that is important is real-time proving. In order to have synchronous composability, you actually need two things, not just one. You need the shared sequencing, that's pillar number one. Pillar number two is the real-time proving. Basically, you need the ability for the rollups to not have to trust each other. They need to have proofs that things are working as expected, like withdrawals are actually happening and deposits are actually happening as expected. And the communication of trust, the trust language, if you will, is proofs. And by real-time proofs, I mean like proofs that can be generated within the slot. So at most, the latency can be one slot. And so if we're talking about base sequencing, the latency can be at most 12 seconds. And so we don't have SNOCs that can prove ZKVM statements within 12 seconds. Actually, there's someone today, Shumo from Nebra, actually told me that he has like a straight line visibility towards 10-second-ish proving time for his ZKVM, which would be amazing. And he thinks he'll get it ready, within a few weeks. And so, the tech is moving extremely, extremely fast. The other piece of good news is that we have a really, somewhat compelling a training wheel, which is TEs, which provide real-time proving out of the box. And so there's various projects out there. There's Puffer, for example. There's T1 that are looking to use TEs to experiment with this synchronous composability while we wait for the SNOCs real-time proving to come. And it's unclear how long we'll have to wait for the real-time proving, but my bullish take is that in a year or so we'll have real-time proving. This is partly because if you look at the historical trend, it's like exponential improvement is much faster than Moore's law. It's call it 5 to 10x better every single year, which is insane. And another reason to be bullish is that we have SNOC ASICs coming. There's 3 different companies, Axial, SciSig, and Fabric, each of which have started the tape-out process or have already manufactured, actually, in the case of Axial, their SNOC ASIC. And once these ASICs get tested and integrated into systems and whatnot, then we'll see performance go through the roof. So yeah, there's kind of all this tangential infrastructure that needs to be built. And then the last one that I'll mention is Ag Layer, where if you have multiple transactions that form what I call a super transaction, so you have these constituent simple transactions that form a synchronous super transaction, you want to make sure that it doesn't get unbundled. And you kind of only execute one leg but not the other. And this is what Ag Layer solves for, is this notion of cross rollup or cross L2 bundle safety, which is also built on top of SNOCs. So there's a lot to do. to get to this like shared sequencing and synchronous composability vision. But the initial steps of decentralizing purely for other reasons, like around regulatory considerations, or around like mimetic considerations, or maybe you're launching a new token and you want to have some sort of credible story for that token, then I think decentralization should be an extremely easy step. And to my knowledge, all the top rollups have signaled that they want to decentralize, and I believe them. I don't think it's just like this vacuous virtue signaling. I guess one exception is MEGA-ETH, where they're saying we're gonna go all in on this centralized sequencer. The centralized sequencer is going to be a massively sophisticated server, and that's going to give us 100,000 TPS. Now, I think this is an interesting and valid take. My kind of counter argument to that would be that with proposer builder separation, you can have the builders be extremely sophisticated and kind of run the sequences on your behalf, if you will. And what will happen is that if it so happens that there's 100,000 TPS with like fee-paying transactions, then the builders, because they're competing with each other, they necessarily have to build blocks for those, because if you don't, then your blocks will be less valuable and you'll lose relative to the other builders that do. And so in some sense, the searchers and the builders, their job is to just sweep up all the MEV that they can find. If they miss out a few pieces of MEV here and there, then they suddenly become uncompetitive. It's a very cutthroat industry. And so if there's 100,000 TPS of demand, then all the infrastructure to support 100,000 TPS will be put in place. I guess like one like potential counter argument to this counter argument would be that PBS itself like has a little bit of overhead when the proposer kind of requests a block from the builder, there's a little bit of latency that's added there. And so if you're aiming for 1 millisecond block times, which is what MEGA-ETH is advertising, then you can't get that at this handoff point at the slot boundary, if that makes sense.
Cartesi is your home for app-specific rollups. At the forefront of developing new tools and platforms that enhance the capabilities of blockchain technology, Cartesi enables applications that are flexible and built to scale. Build on a full Linux environment and use traditional software libraries, but in blockchain development. Go to cartesi.io, that's cartesi.io, to learn more about building your own app chain today.
Everclear is pioneering the clearing layer. The clearing layer can almost be thought of as splitwise when you go on a trip with friends, but for the blockchain. What I mean by that is when users are sending cross-chain messages, there's oftentimes fillers and solvers who have balances left on different chains that they need to rebalance and reset their positions. This is where Everclear comes in. Everclear is pioneering a collaborative approach to the chain abstraction future, and they are willing to work with interoperability partners, solvers, and other providers in the space to build a interoperable and chain abstraction future. Check out Everclear at everclear.org, and welcome back to the Rollup.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you've heard of Rise Chain as well.
Yes. So Rise Chain,
yeah.
Interestingly, wants to become a base rollup. So
yes.
That may be like the MEGA-ETH, but based. So they're based
yes.
the MEGA and MEGA.
Yeah, which I think is particularly interesting. And then we had a pretty technical conversation with the Tycho team building Gwyneth and kind of talking a lot about cross-bundle MEV and the composability benefits. And then we're also pretty big fans of what the Spire Labs team is trying to do with their base stack. I'm a big fan of the idea of based L3s over based L2s, which settle. So basically, you've probably heard this a bajillion times, but the big problem with base rollups is a 12-second kind of block times on Ethereum. Yes, you can do pre-comps, but we need some sort of L1 improvements, which kind of Max was going on about on Bankless. Okay, well, why don't we just skip that and just rely on the 2-second pre-confirmations of Arbitrum 1 or Optimism, etc., and build based L3s to settle the L2. So I think that's going to be a particularly interesting idea, and Inspire can pull that off and bring the base stack that they're trying to build into like Rollups as a service providers. That'll be also particularly cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as you said, we're going to have L3s have a shared sequencer, which is the L2 within these ecosystems. And a lot of the infrastructure to, the ag layer, the shared deposits, all of that stuff will, hopefully get figured out at the L2 before it has to be figured out for the L1 base sequencer.
Yes.
One very tiny correction, and it's kind of a common misconception, is that we need to make L1 changes in order to enable pre-confirmations. Somehow people think that it's part of the roadmap in the sense that you need to do a hard fork to enable pre-confirmations. Actually, amazingly, you don't need to do any hard fork. You can just use the infrastructure as it is today, and you can permissionlessly have these cryptoeconomic commitments where basically as a user, I will talk to the next block producer and I will get a promise from them to include my transaction at a specific position. So if I'm doing a Uniswap trade, I know exactly what I'm paying for my trade. And if this promise is not honored, then I know for sure that this entity will lose money, that they'll get slashed. And potentially even I could have a cryptoeconomic guarantee that I will get compensation. If you pay for insurance, you'll get the compensation. And this relies on basically smart contracts where these sequences would deposit collateral, and on off-chain agreements. So these are bilateral agreements between the user and the next L1 proposer, and it doesn't require any hard fork. I guess now that I think about it, what you're alluding to is this idea of not really doing pre-confirmations, but doing another kind of dumber thing in some sense, which is to just reduce the slot times. So if we could reduce the L1 slot times,
you are so
then we don't
against the L1 changes. You want to keep Ethereum immutable and just keep it how it is.
Oh, no. I love the idea of reducing the slot times.
Okay.
I'm one of the accelerationists. I want Ethereum L1 to have all the goodies, and I think that there is low hanging fruit to improve the L1, and if we can reduce the slot times, that's amazing, because as Max mentioned and as you mentioned, it would make the base sequencer even more compelling.
Justin, we didn't talk about current rollups, and I know that you didn't want to touch too much on base rollups. We've got a couple more minutes left, and I think that this is a conversation that I heard actually on the podcast with Kyle Samani on Bankless, which was we talked about current centralized sequenced rollups opting into a decentralized model, or decentralizing their sequencing, or opting into a shared model, which is kind of one and the same, but two different kind of ways of thinking about it. What we didn't talk about is something like a current rollup going into a based model, and kind of what that looks like. And the big concern, again, I think comes down to losing the revenue. So the amount of revenue that, say, Arbitrum makes in their centralized sequencer is significant. If Arbitrum was like, let's be a base rollup and inherit all of the liveness properties and the composability properties of Ethereum L1, they would be subject to losing. Their business would be inherently take a downturn. Now, in today's world, there's still no sequencer fee redistribution to token holders or stakers of any kind. I assume for some sort of regulatory purpose. In my assumptions, I think that's going to happen, or else I would see a lot of applications on these general purpose L2s, if you will, kind of go launch their own app chains, which is a big part of our kind of thesis, I think, is that if you're an L2 and you're not going to figure out a way to reward your builders, which I think a lot of these teams do through grants and things, but if there's not a consistent distribution philosophy, then why would they kind of stay there? They could just kind of go and do their own app chain and figure out the interoperability or the composability, but whether through a based model or through something like AgLayer, or through these kind of intent-based interoperability standards. And so kind of coming back to the crux of it, Do you foresee any of the current large rollups or just rollups in general transitioning from the centralized model of sequencing and not going to shared or decentralized model, but rather transitioning to a based model?
Right. So these things are actually not mutually exclusive, the decentralized, shared, and based. So I would actually think about it as a progression. You have like the most straightforward decentralized sequencer, which is one that you control with your token. And then kind of that, that should be a fairly easy step from an incentive standpoint. The next kind of level up is that you opt into a decentralized sequencer, which you don't control. And presumably the reason why you would do that is because it's a shared sequencer that gives you composability benefits. And here, there's a bit more of a question mark around incentive alignment. But like the shared sequencer, more likely than not, is going to be decentralized because it needs to be credibly neutral. If it's just some centralized server, it is not a compelling shared sequencer. And then there's kind of the next level after that, where it's decentralized, it's shared, and it's specifically the L1. Now, the question that you had around incentive alignment, this worry of giving up the fees, that's actually not specific to base sequencing. It's at the second rung of the shared sequencer. And the basically the argument that I have is kind of this two-pronged argument. Prong number one, that the ratio of congestion to consension is going to get better with the better dexes. That's going to take some time, but that's what I think the industry will be moving towards. And then prong number two, which in some sense is insurance in case the first thesis doesn't work out, which is that let's assume that there's tons of MEV. Well, then we have execution tickets as a potential technical solution. And maybe there's like some other thing that we didn't think of. For example, there's this notion of execution auctions, which is also a way to capture. The problem with execution auctions is that you need the attesters to come into play. So Barnaby calls it a super-based rollup, where not only do you enroll the L1 proposers, but you also enroll the L1 attesters. But yeah, like the design space is kind of open, and the motivation for exploring this kind of MEV redistribution mechanism will depend on the amount of MEV.
Got it. Coming back to the original point prior to that question about you wanting to have L1 have all the goodies, is there like a perceived balance between economic activity on rollups versus the L1, and kind of like what maybe raising the gas limit could do for rollups and L1 users? Like, do you see a balance that you have, or a mental model for going forward how you want to see economic activity be kind of dispersed amongst rollups and the L1?
Yeah, so I think we should try and scale the L1, as aggressively as we can within the bounds of decentralization. So at all costs, we want to preserve, what's unique to Ethereum, which is this extremely strong decentralization. But within those bounds, we want to, max the gas limit. And it turns out, in my opinion, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. Like we could, increase the gas limit by orders of magnitude. And part of the reason why I say that is because in the end game, the layer 1 EVM will be snarkified, and once you have it snarkified, the attesters no longer have to re-execute L1 transactions. They can just verify the snark. And so for them doing their job of voting on the tip of the chain, on the valid tip of the chain, it will be extremely easy. You can do it on a phone or smartwatch. It doesn't matter what the gas limit is. The gas limit can be, there could be no gas limit. It could be like, a trillion gas per block or something, and you would still verify your snark in 1 millisecond. But that's the end game. But there's intermediate stages where we have, statelessness, for example, or one like really low hanging optimization is this idea that we can delay the state route to the beginning of the next slot. So the state route is basically provided in some sense at the end of the current slot, and providing it at the start of the next slot is essentially equivalent, but it just buys you an extra 12 seconds. And so executing these transactions is no longer part of the critical path, and so we can increase the gas limit and just be more efficient. Now, one of the things that I'm extremely excited about is this notion of a native rollup. Once we've snarkified the L1 EVM, we can create a precompile which will essentially like verify these snarks and verify arbitrary EVM state transitions. And so now anyone can spin up an instance of the L1 EVM, and it's kind of like execution sharding, except that it's so much better than execution sharding, because the vision for execution sharding was that there's 64 or 1024 Ethereum copies of the Ethereum L1, and with this precompile you can have as many rollups as you want. And the other big advantage is that they're programmable. They don't have to be exact copies of the L1. If you want to have your own governance wrapper, or public goods distribution, or your own gas token, or whatever it is, you can customize the logic around the EVM precompile. And what I expect will happen is that all the existing EVM equivalent rollups will adopt this precompile because it gives them two benefits. One is that the EVM implementation will be bug-free. It will be literally equivalent to the L1 by construction. And two, it won't need to be upgraded whenever the L1 is a hard fork. So we were talking about this L1 hard fork that adds some sort of new gas optimization for Uniswap. Well, what needs to happen is that all the EVM equivalent rollups need to use their governance in order to update their own implementation of the EVM. Rollups will get that for free if they use the opcode, because it will always be one-for-one compatible with the R1. And I guess the third benefit is that you've reduced potentially hundreds of thousands or millions of lines of code down to one line of code, which you don't have to re-implement your snark circuit or do these crazy fraud proofs. All of that complexity just evaporates, and you just call this one opcode. And I guess as a rollup developer, like anyone can now become a rollup developer and spin up a new rollup, and it's going to be a very compelling future. And now, if you consider L1 execution as being the sum of all these L1 instances, then it's effectively like unbounded amounts of execution. The only real bottleneck is going to be data availability. In other words, it's going to be bandwidth.
I think we have just a couple more minutes, and you bring me to first of all, that's very exciting. That vision. I think ZKVMs play a big part in a similar role of reducing the amount of lines of code needed for these kind of circuits to happen. And the generalizable nature of ZKVMs will be very helpful in this progression. While I do think there's going to be, as you mentioned, some more different types of custom circuits involved. Now, at the end, you talked about data availability being the bottleneck. I think you kind of read my mind, because we've been kind of playing back and forth with the idea of data availability, whether or not it's a commodity, and the idea behind where sequencing is the ordering and execution is the actual execution of the transaction, and the actual execution accruing the value. The rollup operators get a lot of the MEV. Data availability for Ethereum doesn't get a whole lot. Data availability layers like Celestia, IconDA, Avail, they're not getting paid that much in fees for kind of doing what they're doing. But my question to you actually is more around whether you view these modular data availability providers like Celestia, IconDA, Avail, etc., as collaborative to the Ethereum roadmap, or as competitive in nature to the Ethereum roadmap with regards to post EIP 4844 and the way that Ethereum is trending by outsourcing execution to rollups and kind of being the main data availability layer for them, at least in theory. So curious how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, so I think in the grand scheme of things, they're collaborative in the sense that they accelerate the development. It's yet another experiment. It's also yet another option for Validiums. So as you said, the Validiums can become Celestiums if they consume Celestia data availability, and that's great that you have this option. Now, my particular thesis is that while there's this amazing accelerationism in the short and medium term, in the long term, it's winner take all, and that's for a couple of reasons. Reason number one is that I believe that a single platform, call it Ethereum Layer 1, can provide enough data availability for the whole world. And I have this kind of back of the envelope roadmap where we can get to 10 million transactions per second within the next 10 years. And that's enough for the whole world. It's 100 transactions per day per human. So it's plenty. And then the other kind of reason why I think it's winner take most, it kind of goes back to this notion of synchronous composability and network effects, which is that if you have an external data availability system like Celestia, you're introducing a new sequencer, right? Like Celestia has a sequencer, like one block after the other. And so now your Celestium is no longer synchronously composable with, your typical base rollup. And so that's going to add some friction, and you're going to have to fall back to this asynchronous model, blah, blah, blah. And so I'm like, I love the Celestia team. I think they've done a great job, accelerating the space. But I think ultimately it's going to be winner take most. And my default position is that more likely than not, Ethereum will win that business opportunity. Now, one interesting question is data availability going to be a commodity in the sense that it's going to be like dirt cheap, or is it going to be like a meaningful source of value? And like I would actually lean towards the second direction, and the reason is that because of like this decentralization constraint that we have with Ethereum, we're limiting consensus participants to home internet connections. And if you think of danksharding, it's basically a multiplier over the home internet connection, which is your limitation, and the multiplier, call it 100x. Okay, so basically all the world's financial activity needs to fit within 100 home internet connections. And that is a lot. It's enough to do like these 10 million transactions per second, but it's not like crazy AWS like big data stuff. And so my personal thesis is that the world in general is going to want to put as much as possible on Ethereum, and there's going to be essentially unlimited demand. And that's partially because of this induced demand, where the more supply you provide, like the more demand there is. Just like bandwidth, like every time your home your ISP gives you a better internet connection, you just start using higher definition video or whatever it is, and YouTube automatically will consume the appropriate amount of bandwidth. And I think this is what will happen. Like businesses will just, every time Ethereum scales, they will just put more and more of their business on chain. And then the other aspect is around these network effects of shared security and shared composability, and shared synchrony, I should say, which means that there's a lot of value to just being on the Manhattan of the Internet of Value. Like you don't want to be like in the suburbs and have to take the taxi every day. That sucks. You want to be like where the action happens, because that's where your business can thrive. And so what I think will happen, roughly speaking, or at least what I hope will happen, is that there's going to be 10 million transactions per second, and each transaction will pay less than a cent in data availability fees. And the math is just so extreme when you're operating at 10 million transactions per second that even a tenth of a cent is $1 billion per day of income. So for every tenth of a cent, that's $1 billion per day. So let's say it's like half a cent. That would be $5 billion per day of income for Ethereum. And that's great because it's the kind of like very large business, like Nvidia or like Apple, and like we can muster like a multi-trillion-dollar valuations purely based on the flows. And then this is a whole different topic, but on top of this base valuation of trillions of dollars, there is this opportunity for Ether to be money, to be collateral as economic security, but also as economic bandwidth for decentralized stablecoins, blah, blah, blah. Long story short, there's a very exciting potential roadmap over the next 10 years.
Thank you, Justin, for coming on and sharing a lot of awesome insights. Appreciate you answering our questions thoroughly.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.